The hearing room was packed to the edges. Cameramen flanked the sides, their lenses aimed like rifles. The gold seal of the House Oversight Committee glinted above the panel of lawmakers. In the center of the room, unflinching, sat actor Jonathan Roumie. Young, poised, and confident, he adjusted the mic with the calm of someone who knew exactly why he was there. Across from him, Representative Ayanna Pressley leaned back in her leather chair, brows arched, lips curled ever so slightly. She had already made headlines this week for her viral jabs, her pointed gestures, and her fiery defense of her party. And now she was ready for a new target. "Let's be honest here," Pressley began, voice dripping with controlled sarcasm. "We've seen a lot of self-proclaimed patriots waltz into this chamber, but I've got to ask, Mr. Roumie, what makes you think you belong at this table?" Gasps bubbled through the audience. Jonathan didn't flinch. He just stared, unmoving, unblinking. The chairperson attempted to move forward, but Ayanna raised a finger. "No, I really want to know," she pressed, turning slightly toward the cameras. "Because this isn't a social media live stream. This is Congress." Jonathan finally leaned in, his hands folded neatly. "What makes me belong here, Congresswoman?" he said with cool clarity. "The same thing that scares you about me. I don't owe anyone in this room a damn thing." The room stiffened. Ayanna smirked. "You're not a real man of power," she fired. "You're a headline, a puppet with good lighting." Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink. He just opened the file in front of him, precisely tabbed, meticulously documented. "Let's look at yours then," he said. And just like that, the mood shifted. Ayanna's smirk faded. Jonathan continued. "Page 1, your record on border security. Page 2, your comments on the DNC email leaks. Page 3, every word hit like a hammer." Ayanna Pressley arrived like she owned the room. Hair flawless, heels sharp, a pair of sunglasses she didn't bother removing as she strode past aides and interns in the Rayburn hallway. Every step screamed, "This is my domain." The House panel on community reform had just begun. But this wasn't about bills or crime stats today. Not for Ayanna. She leaned into the mic and smiled. That kind of smile that only came right before a hit job. "And now," she said, pausing dramatically, "we welcome Jonathan Roumie." A few staffers glanced at each other. They knew the tone. Ayanna had come prepared to humiliate someone. Jonathan stood and walked toward the table with a binder in his hand and a calmness that almost looked out of place. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just walked. His heels didn't click like Ayanna's, but his presence landed. "Ms. Pressley," Jonathan began, "you call yourself a voice for truth, but tell me, what's so truthful about parroting conspiracy theories from extremist blogs?" Ayanna didn't blink. "Is this a hearing or a roast, Congressman?" she asked. The crowd stirred. Jonathan leaned in, lips curled. "You're not used to being questioned, are you?" Jonathan flipped open his binder. "I'm used to facts. If you want to have a fact-based conversation, I'm ready. If not, I suggest you stop wasting taxpayer time with rehearsed one-liners." The blow landed harder than expected. Ayanna blinked. From the side bench, Representative Thomas Massey stifled a grin. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to zoom in tighter. This wasn't going to be a routine hearing. Ayanna tried to recover. "We don't need propaganda dressed up as patriotism," Jonathan cut in. "We don't need elected officials who treat hearings like viral clips either." Gasps. Aides' fingers flew across phone screens. Hashtags were already being typed. This wasn't a backroom debate. This was now a live showdown. And Jonathan, calm, precise, and ruthless, had just drawn first blood. The room tensed. Ayanna Pressley leaned back in her leather chair, arms folded, convinced Jonathan would stumble next. But Jonathan didn't fumble with his notes. He didn't sip from a water bottle or look for approval. Instead, he opened his binder like it was a weapon. "I'd like to begin," Jonathan said, "with your voting record, Congresswoman." Ayanna smirked. "Excuse me?" Jonathan turned a page. "You voted against H.R. 7804, the Safe Communities Expansion Act. You claimed it targeted communities of color, but crime rates in your district have risen by 23% in the last year alone. And that bill would have funded more patrols, local mental health units, and small business security upgrades." A hush fell. Ayanna's expression hardened. Jonathan kept going. "You've gone on air saying you support law and order, but you also co-sponsored House Resolution 1189, which sought to cut federal funding to cities that enforce immigration law." Ayanna interrupted. "You don't understand our communities." Jonathan looked her dead in the eye. "No, I just don't make excuses while people die in the streets." The impact was immediate. One of the interns audibly whispered, "Whoa!" Ayanna's aide leaned toward her with a phone screen lit up. Tweets were already exploding. Jonathan didn't stop. "Your campaign spent over $76,000 last quarter on strategic consulting from a firm tied to your cousin. Transparency or nepotism? Watch yourself," Ayanna said, voice low now, almost a growl. "I am," Jonathan replied, his voice steady. "And I'm watching a member of Congress try to posture instead of serve." A loud gavel cracked. "Order, member," someone shouted from the panel chair. Jonathan paused, closed the binder halfway, and addressed the chair directly. "I was invited to speak. I'm simply citing public records. If this committee values truth, I'll continue. If not, I'll yield and let Ms. Pressley spin fiction." Even those who had dismissed Jonathan as an actor or celebrity now leaned in, curious, maybe even impressed. He wasn't grandstanding, he was prosecuting. And for the first time, Ayanna Pressley didn't look smug. She looked rattled. Ayanna Pressley sat forward, lips pursed, and adjusted the mic like it was a blade she was about to wield. Her voice rose, cutting through the murmurs in the room. "You think you know how to lead a district like mine?" she snapped. "You read off paper like that makes you powerful. My community doesn't need some actor quoting numbers. They need someone who looks like them, lives like them, and fights for them." Some in the room clapped. Others side-eyed the dig. Jonathan didn't flinch. Ayanna leaned in. "You parade around here with your self-righteous binder and talk about crime and nepotism. At least I'm not on the payroll of extremists trying to roll back women's rights and gut voting access." Jonathan Roumie opened his mouth, but Ayanna Pressley cut him off. "You stand here pretending to be a voice for truth, but you're a mouthpiece, a mask, a mirror held up to the same people who've tried to erase us for decades." It was fiery, emotional, powerful for a moment, but then Jonathan simply raised a finger and said, "Are you finished?" Ayanna blinked. Jonathan leaned forward. "You just attacked my appearance, my background, and even my gender, all while claiming to fight for women. You just accused me of being a puppet without denying a single fact I presented. Not one." He held up the binder again. "This isn't a prop. It's your record." The panel quieted again. "You say I don't look like your community," Jonathan continued. "Well, let me be crystal clear. I don't need to look like you to believe that every American, regardless of background, deserves the truth. Not slogans, not division, not spin." A few heads nodded, some of them on Ayanna's side of the aisle. Jonathan's voice dropped to a calm, forceful register. "I don't hate you, Congresswoman. I don't question your identity, but I do question your integrity. And if you think I'll sit here quietly while you play victim and avoid accountability, then you don't know me at all." The room stayed silent. Ayanna glanced away, jaw tight. And Jonathan, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He owned the room with facts, and he wasn't done yet. Jonathan didn't even blink. With the steady motion of someone who had rehearsed for war, he opened the binder on the table before him. The sound of the clip snapping echoed louder than Ayanna's outburst moments before. He didn't look at Pressley. He looked at the audience straight through the cameras, like he was speaking to millions beyond the walls of that marble-lined hearing room. "Let's begin with House Resolution 762, Jonathan said, flipping the page. "You co-sponsored it with the claim that it would increase community investments. What it actually did was route nearly $11 million to private consulting firms, most of them donors, to your campaign." Gasps murmured across the room. Jonathan's voice remained composed. "Next, Senate crossover file 1943. You lobbied for this one under the banner of public safety, but this bill stripped cash bail protections for repeat offenders in your district, and violent crime rose 19% in the following 11 months. Your district, not mine." Ayanna shifted in her seat. Jonathan raised his eyes, then flipped another page. "And just so we're clear, Congresswoman Pressley, this isn't personal. It's procedural. It's about leadership. It's about truth." He paused. "You want to call me a puppet of the right? Fine. But you better hope people don't start calling you something worse. A fraud with a slogan." The words hit like a steel bat wrapped in velvet. Jonathan's tone never rose. He didn't need to shout. The truth did all the shouting for him. Ayanna leaned in as if to respond, but Jonathan beat her to it again. "Because here's what I know. Power doesn't come from screaming across a table. It doesn't come from identity shields or TV moments. It comes from standing in front of the people who elected you and showing receipts." He held up the final page bold and clear. An ethics complaint filed just 2 weeks prior. Signed, verified. And this, Jonathan added, is on public record. You can't spin it. You can't call it racism or sexism or whatever is trending this week. It's documented, it's real, and it's time someone said it out loud. The air in the room shifted. Pressley looked around, but no one jumped to her defense. Jonathan simply closed the binder calmly, slowly, and then, for the first time that morning, he smiled. But it wasn't smug, it was confident, certain, like a man who had just reclaimed the meaning of strength without ever once raising his voice. Ayanna Pressley was no longer seated upright. She leaned forward, arms braced on the desk, eyes narrowed, not with confusion, but with fury. Her voice, when it came, was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're not here to speak a truth, Jonathan," she snapped. "You're here for a headline. You want to be the next viral darling of the hard right, writing on manufactured outrage and Fox News retweets. But let me remind you, this is Congress, not some podcast." Jonathan didn't flinch. He tilted his head, calm, almost amused. "Is that your defense? That I'm too effective at communicating the facts?" Ayanna barked a laugh, sarcastic and bitter. "You're a storm in heels and hairspray, nothing more." Jonathan stepped out from behind the table. No podium, no microphone, just his voice in a room full of staffers, aides, journalists, in silence. "I grew up listening to politicians like you telling girls like me to stay in their place," he said, his tone unwavering. "And do you know what the place always was? Silent, grateful, malleable. That's not my America. That's not the Constitution I defend." He turned to the press. "She says this is Congress, not a podcast. Then maybe Congress should stop sounding like a TikTok filter." A few gasps, one or two chuckles, quiet but real. Jonathan's voice dropped lower. "You call me a puppet, Ayanna, but everything I've said today came from documents you signed, votes you cast, words you said." He paused. "I didn't come here to be liked. I came here because truth needs a spine." And then with a slow, deliberate turn, he faced Ayanna one final time. "I'm not angry because you insulted me. I'm not threatened by the names you call me. I'm here to remind you, you don't get to be the only woman in the room with power. Not anymore." For a moment, Ayanna had no reply. And in that silence, it wasn't Jonathan who looked out of place. It was her opponent. The air in the chamber was heavy now, thick with tension, reputations, and microphones that suddenly felt far too sensitive. Ayanna Pressley finally stood up, pushing her chair back with a screech that echoed across the room. Her arms crossed, her expression curled into a smirk of defiance. "You're desperate to be seen," she sneered. "But there's a difference between being seen and being respected. You came in here with attitude and theatrics, not policy, not substance." Jonathan didn't move an inch. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a red folder. Respect isn't earned through approval. It's earned through standing in the fire and not backing down. "You want substance?" He opened the folder. One by one, he laid out the documents, vote records, committee memos, floor transcripts, screenshots of deleted tweets. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. "This is the bill you co-sponsored that funneled $14 million into a program that failed. Basic oversight. This is the floor vote where you abstained on school safety legislation that your constituents begged you to support. And this," Jonathan held up a crisp, printed tweet, "is where you called constitutionalists a threat to order. That wasn't a soundbite. That was you, Congresswoman." Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "You're distorting." "No," Jonathan cut her off. "I'm documenting." Gasps rippled through the crowd as journalists leaned in, snapping photos, reporters scribbling in notebooks. "This isn't a performance. This is accountability. And if that feels like a threat, maybe you've grown too comfortable without it." Ayanna opened her mouth but said nothing because the documents were right there. Paper against polished wood, lined up like an indictment. Not in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion. Jonathan didn't gloat. He just let the silence speak. Because in that moment, Ayanna Pressley wasn't battling a narrative. She was staring at her own record, and it had a louder voice than any monologue she could deliver. The silence after Jonathan's takedown was nearly deafening. Ayanna, who had walked in with her signature confidence and the quiet arrogance of media favor, suddenly looked disarmed, not by volume but by truth. Cameras didn't turn away. If anything, they zoomed in. The room had shifted, not just in tone but in power. The kind of shift that doesn't come from polls or party lines, but from one voice refusing to shrink. Jonathan didn't need to yell. He didn't need to posture. He let Pressley's own record testify against her, but it wasn't over. Ayanna gathered herself, squared her shoulders, and fired back with what she thought would be the final blow. You don't speak for real women in politics. You're a plant, a performance, a token for a party that doesn't value truth, only control. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Then he walked to the center of the hearing room and looked each member in the eye. One by one, deliberate, controlled. I didn't come here to be liked, he began. I came here to make sure the people who've been ignored, mocked, silenced, labeled know they still have a voice, even when it's inconvenient, even when it makes the powerful squirm. He pointed at the line of documents still resting on the table. This isn't theater. This is transparency. You don't get to rewrite the record just because you don't like the reader. Someone in the gallery clapped, just once, then another, then a few more. Ayanna raised her hand, trying to shut it down, but Jonathan didn't flinch. You can try to shame me. You can try to label me, but I've done my homework. I've read every line, every bill, every footnote you hoped no one would question. And then he did what no one expected. He pulled out a letter, a personal one, from a young girl in Texas named Rachel, printed in careful handwriting. The note read, "Mr. Jonathan, thank you for saying what I wish my mom could say in her meetings. They call her names because she believes in all and the Constitution. But when I see you, I know we're not alone." Jonathan held the letter high. "This is who I'm here for." No one interrupted him this time because, in that moment, the debate wasn't between parties or ideologies. It was between truth and noise, between records and rhetoric, and Jonathan had made sure which one was louder. The chair of the committee cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with how the room had turned. Ayanna looked down at her tablet, scrolling aimlessly, while a CNN correspondent outside the chamber whispered, "That letter that changed the temperature." But Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned to the panel and said, "Let's talk about power, not the power you cling to with titles and blue check marks, but the power you forget comes from the people." His voice never wavered. "You've spent years pretending dissent is disinformation, that convictions are conspiracy, that moral clarity is extremism." He gestured toward Ayanna, but not with malice, with precision. This country doesn't belong to one party. It doesn't belong to the loudest pundit. And it sure doesn't belong to those who label truth as dangerous just because it doesn't serve their narrative. The room shifted again across social media. The clip was already going viral. The phrase, "power comes from the people," began trending. Reporters outside weren't quoting Ayanna Pressley anymore. They were quoting Rachel from Texas. Ayanna finally broke her silence with a sneer. "You really think this show changes anything? They'll clip you, meme you, and move on? You're not part of the system. You're a soundbite." Jonathan didn't flinch. "That's the difference between us," he replied. "You're fighting for a headline. I'm standing for people who never get one." The room didn't erupt. It leaned in. No theatrics, no applause, just the stillness that follows truth when it lands without apology. He walked back to his seat, stacked the documents he had brought, and looked directly at Ayanna one last time. "You don't get to decide who belongs in the conversation anymore." And just like that, the hearing wasn't about Jonathan's credentials. It was about their silence and his refusal to join it. The cameras were still rolling, but the hearing had long since left the agenda. Ayanna Pressley adjusted her posture, leaned back, and crossed her arms like a final statement. Jonathan remained standing. He hadn't moved since the moment he finished speaking. The committee chair cleared his throat again. "Ms. Roumie, your time has expired." But the room already knew. So had something else. Jonathan's voice returned once more, not for rebuttal, but for remembrance. "My time may be up here, but the American people's patience is what truly ran out. With politicians who perform instead of serve, with representatives who mock instead of listen, with institutions that punish those who dare to dissent." He stepped away from the podium, but paused halfway. "You call this chamber sacred, yet you desecrate it with double standards. You speak of unity while dividing on camera and fundraising off outrage. And then almost quietly, you're not mad because I broke decorum. You're mad because I broke your narrative." One of the reporters in the press section dropped his pen. Another typed the quote so fast it misspelled decorum. Ayanna opened her mouth again, but nothing came. For once, the soundbite machine had jammed. Jonathan looked to the gallery, not the press, not the lawmakers, but the citizens seated above. To the people watching, you don't need a podium to speak truth. You don't need a title to stand for what's right. And you don't need permission to remind this country who it belongs to. With that, he walked out. No raised voice, no drop in mic, just the echo of conviction in a building that had tried to silence it. Outside, the crowd had swelled, not for protest, but for witness. Phones were out, eyes were fixed, and as Jonathan descended the Capitol steps, one voice shouted from the back, "You didn't just speak, you exposed all of them." He nodded without a word. Not every story ends with applause. Some end with a pause so deafening it shakes the walls louder than any cheer. Some stories don't fade with the headlines. They reverberate through the culture. What happened between Jonathan Roumie and Ayanna Pressley wasn't just a clash of ideology. It was a moment that stripped away the scripts, the smug performances, and the staged sound bites. Jonathan didn't show up to play a part. He showed up to tear down the curtain. When Ayanna smirked and tried to define power by appearance, status, or party, Jonathan redefined it with facts, poise, and fire. He didn't need applause. He brought truth. He didn't shout over the noise. He made the room listen. This wasn't about a viral quote. It was about revealing who was really working for the people and who was just performing for the cameras. And in the end, it was clear, power doesn't come from a title or a seat behind a nameplate. It comes from standing when everyone tells you to sit down. And just like that, the power dynamic shifted. It wasn't about the headlines or the viral quotes. It was about truth and transparency. Jonathan Roumie showed up, not to perform, but to make sure the real voices were heard. Let's not let this moment fade away. If you believe in standing up for the truth, the people, and real power, hit that subscribe button and join this conversation. Don't miss out on more powerful content like this. Thanks for watching, and remember, the fight for truth never stops.